And then I really began to realize how the old system would have worked with all the airplanes at these various SAC bases, and the weapons they were going to go to war with were someplace else. And it never would have worked. So then we realized how truly savvy General LeMay was. But we finally got into the 47s. You realized on maybe your second flight in a B-47 that the B-29 was archaic and was never going to be a factor in a future war. The B-50 was a modernized B-29, and it would have been of some use for a little while. But we had another airplane called the B-36, which we referred to it when we were second lieutenants. We referred to that thing as an LST, which stood for Large Slow Target. And boy, we wanted to avoid that airplane in any way, fashion, because that's what it was. The contract for the B-36, it was a huge airplane, huge. But the contract was signed in 1940. And the only reason it was even signed and intended to be used was we were afraid, or the people in Washington were afraid that Germany was going to defeat England. And we were going to be left having to fight the Germans from the United States and Canada. So they said, we better get ourselves one big fat airplane. And that's God's truth. By the time we got into the war, and by the time we began to see what was happening in the course of the war, the B-47 was the airplane that won the Cold War. Then along comes the B-52, which was nothing but a big B-47. And General LeMay himself was quoted many times as saying that the only thing wrong with the B-47 was that it wasn't big enough. I got to have a bigger airplane, so they got the B-52. Now that's a gross simplification, but it's the truth. The B-47 was designed as a medium bomber. It was supposed to take the place of the medium bombers that were used in World War II, such as this one right here, which was a fantastic airplane in World War II. This is B-25, and it was my first bomber that I flew, preparation for the B-29. But it was an outstanding airplane. It flew just about any kind of mission you wanted it to fly. And it did a hell of a good job, except, like General LeMay said, the B-47 is a swept-wing B-25. This is a good heavy airplane. It could carry a nice load. There wasn't enough room to put enough fuel in it, so we had to have underwing tanks in the B-47, and it had to be air refuelable in the air, which was an exciting piece of work. But he said, that's what we have here. It's a marvelous airplane, but it's a jet-propelled swept-wing B-25, which is why I brought this one along today. This was a marvelous airplane. It was a pilot's dream, the B-25, it really was. I really enjoyed flying it. But
Bill, take a second and describe the feeling, the pilot's view of flying that airplane and some of your airplanes, sir, please.
Okay, well, this would be a good one to start with. By the time I got into B-25s, they were being used by Strategic Air Command before I got into bombers. General LeMay was very unhappy because after World War II, he did not have any kind of a courier airplane to get top secret material or people with top secret clearances from one place to another. And so he said he talked the materiel people into stripping 50 B-25s, and this is just like one of them. And what they did was they took anything that was heavy all out of the inside and off the exterior of the airplane. So we got a B-25 that weighed about 3/4 of what a bomber version weighed, which meant it could fly 300 miles an hour. Well, that was pretty slow, really, compared to a B-47. But so that's why he very accurately said, I love the B-25. It flies beautifully and will carry an atomic weapon, but it won't get us to Russia. And it was true. So that's why we got the B-47. And with the B-47, we wouldn't have been able to get it to Russia unless we'd had air refueling capability. We could make it to England on fumes, pick up a weapon, have it refueled. You know, this is while the war is going on, right? Which the Russians started because we weren't ever about to start one. Because we could fly nonstop from my base in Louisiana to an RAF base in England, and did so many times. And we could get there just barely with a little bit of, with a westerly wind, and with a little bit of luck, we could get it to an RAF base. So that wasn't enough for General LeMay. So what he did, he took the B-29s, I don't want to confuse you now, but the B-29s had a bigger fuselage and more fuel tanks, and he bought a system from a company in England called Air Refueling Limited. He actually bought it. He got the money from the Senate, and he went over there and bought, I think he bought 3 versions, and what it was a hose refueling system. One B-29 would be the tanker. They'd cut a hole in the bottom of the airplane so that the hose could go out of the bottom of the airplane through the air to the bomber, and after a hazardous exercise of running the fuel through one hose into the hose of the bomber, from the tanker to the bomber. And we'd call all our gunners real operators because the airplane didn't have any guns in it anymore. They were too heavy. But that's what we bought. General LeMay personally went over there and bought it with money that he got from the Senate. And so that was our first airborne tanker receiver system that would get us to Russia. But it would get us there at 300 to 350 miles an hour. And he knew that that was inadequate because the Russians now had jet fighters using the jet engine that the British had given them, our allies. It's very true. Clement Attlee was prime minister, and he was a very left-winger. And he actually gave 2 of those marvelous jet engines to the Russians, and the Russians copied them, and they wound up in their MiGs, which shot us down in Korea. So anyway, the B-25 had a very important connection to what was going on.
Bill,
Yeah.
before you leave the refueling thing,
Yeah.
That is just too bizarre, the refueling. Could you describe what you guys did? Like, I'm trying to think of what we can use as a prop. But, so can you show us, like, was one cable coming out of one guy, or?
We had, no.
Or go ahead and explain what happened one more time, please.
Yeah. The what the system were 6-inch diameter, interior diameter hoses, heavy-duty hoses, and the bomber's hose would be trailed out of their hole in the belly of their bomber. The first time I saw this, it really frightened me. I said, you know, this is what we're going to go to Russia in? Which was true. If the war had started in in 50, 51, 52, 53, that's how we would have gone to Russia. Now, there's a good ending to the story. The tanker hose had to be attached to the receiver hose, that's the bomber, and they would feed them like this around in a great big elliptical fashion that was about a mile long. And once they got the tanker up into inside the bomber, they would disconnect the bomber's hose and connect the tanker's hose into the bomber's refueling system and turn on the boost pumps, and they'd run fuel from the tanker to the bomber. It was very slow. It was only, maybe 2,000 pounds a minute, you know, and jet fuel runs 6,000 pounds a minute. So you need to be able to get a bigger hose and more speed, which they ultimately did. But that's the way it was done. And then the tanker would fly up here above the bomber in about this position to take advantage of gravity. Because if they'd done it like this, they would have been pumping that fuel uphill. Well, they very quickly realized that they had to be up here with the bomber down here. And you'd fly along. The bomber was fat, dumb, and happy. We were down there just having a good time. That poor tanker pilot, he's up there really wrestling that heavy airplane. And it would take him a while to get that necessary fuel to us. And we could take off from most of our tanker airplanes were at a base named Sculthorpe in England, up on the Wash. And we were in our bombers in East Anglia, usually 3 or 4 bases that were leased from the British. They wouldn't even let us do it free. They made us lease those bases from them, unless our English friends. Anyway, and so we did it that way in the 29, and it worked, but it was very minimal. And we've been doing this at a slow speed, and a lot of the tanker-bomber combinations would never even made it to Russia. Some would have been shot down long before they got there.